Shabbat Shalom. On this Shabbat, we are celebrating Yom Yerushalayim. It is actually on the 4th of June, but it's such an important day that we wanted to specifically celebrate it today on this Shabbat. We read in Tehillim 64, God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble. Therefore we are unafraid, even if the earth gives way, even if the mountains tumble into the depths of the sea, even if its waters rage and foam and mountains shake at its disturbance. I hope you're feeling that way this morning. There is a river whose streams gladden the city of God, the holy habitation of Elyon. God is in the city. It will not be moved when daybreak comes. God will help it. Nations were in turmoil. Kingdoms were moved. His voice thundered forth and the earth melted away. Adonai Savaot is with us, our fortress, the God of Yaakov. Come and see the works of Adonai, the astounding deeds he has done on the earth. To the ends of the earth he makes wars cease. He breaks the bow, snaps the spear, burns the shields in the fire. Desist and learn that I am God, supreme over the nations, supreme over the earth. Adonai Tzavaot is with us, our fortress, the God of Yaakov. 4 holidays were added to the Jewish calendar in the 20th century. Yom HaShoah, Yom HaZikron, Yom HaAtzmot, and Yom Yerushalayim. Yom Yerushalayim, Jerusalem Day, is the anniversary of the liberation and unification of Jerusalem under Jewish sovereignty during the Six-Day War in 1967. This liberation marks a historic and prophetic event because on the day of unification, Jerusalem became a city under Jewish sovereignty for the first time in more than 2,000 years. Yom Yerushalayim is celebrated on the 28th day of the month of Iyar, 1 week before Shavuot. We read of God's city. Its name is not London or Rome or Washington. It is Yerushalayim. This name has special significance and importance in the scriptures, and it is unique among the cities of the world. Yireh, the Lord will provide, refers to God's choice of Israel and Jerusalem in particular as his abode. He will see and he will choose this site. Shalayim, with the same root as shalom, is often translated simply peace, but it's much more meaningful than that. Shalom or shalem means perfection, wholeness, completeness. By placing Yireh before Shalem, contrary to normal chronology in Ivrit, the name communicates a timeless message, demonstrating that all of human striving for the noble goals of peace and perfection are actually exercises in futility. If humanity fails to recognize the imperative of following God's commandments, well, we know what the consequences are because we have seen it with our own eyes. But this city is called the city of David. But before David's conquest, this city was controlled by the Jebusites, a Canaanite tribe. Much earlier, at the time of Avraham, we hear of Yerushalayim in connection with the Battle of the Kings, from which Avraham rescued Lot. Avraham paid tithes to Melchizedek in Bereshit 14:18, whose name literally means King of Righteousness. He is called the King of Sim Shalom, Cohen of the Most High God. One Jewish Midrashic tradition declares that Shem was the actual founder of this city. Historically, and we have a great deal of archaeological evidence, and it puts the date of the first settlement of this area between 4,500 and 3,500 BCE, so somewhere around 6,000 years ago. Those who lived there settled near the Gihon Springs because this was the best source of water in the area. We hear of a city on this site in around 2000 BCE from Egyptian sources. That was 4,000 years ago. By the 17th century BCE, the Canaanites had established a walled city with huge boulders weighing as much as 4 to 5 tons and 26 feet high on the eastern side of what became the city of David. Between 1550 and 1400 BCE, this city was a vassal of United Egypt. But as Egypt's power declined, independent tribal kingdoms arose, the Jebusites, the Perizzites, etc. These are tribal groups which ceased to exist sometime before the Roman conquest. According to the scriptures, David conquered the city by stealth between 1010 and 1000 BCE. We read in Shmuel Bet 5, Chronicles Aleph 11. He established his city in the area now known as the City of David. If you've been to Yerushalayim, I'm sure you've visited it. Yerushalayim was the capital of the United Kingdom of Israel. There, David constructed an altar at the location of a threshing floor he had purchased from a Jebusite named Aruna. The city was expanded to the south, and then under King David's son, Solomon, a substantial and beautiful temple was built for worship of the God of Israel. Its location was the site upon which Avraham had offered a ram provided by God in place of his son Yitzhak, Mount Moriah. According to Chronicles, this might also be the site of David's altar. The building of the Mikdash in Yerushalayim focused attention on this city as the center of worship, the place where God's Shekinah was present with Israel. When the kingdom of Israel was split into the kingdom of Israel, the northern 10 tribes, and the kingdom of Yehuda, the southern 2 to 3 tribes, Yerushalayim continued to serve as the capital of the kingdom of Yehuda. Worship of the one true God was maintained by the Leviim at the Mikdash, while the kingdom of Israel went into apostasy and heresy. They located their capital at Shechem, Shumron, and they built their own centers of worship, contravening Torah. At various times, Yerushalayim was attacked and even pillaged by Egyptians, Philistines, Arabs, and Ethiopians. But Yerushalayim continued as the capital of the kingdom of Yehuda for 400 years. It survived an Assyrian siege in 701 BC by Sennacherib, unlike Samaria, the capital of the kingdom of Israel, which fell in 720 BCE. In 597, however, Yerushalayim was successfully besieged by Babylon, resulting in the capture of King Jehoiachin, who was taken into exile. The king's uncle, Zedekiah, was placed on the throne as a puppet, really, by Nebuchadnezzar, but he made the mistake of rebelling, and Nebuchadnezzar recaptured the city, killed Zedekiah's descendants in front of him, and then gouged out his eyes. Zedekiah and other leaders were taken into exile. Yerushalayim was burnt to the ground along with the temple of God. Gedaliah was appointed governor of Yehuda, but he was assassinated less than 2 months later by the last descendant of Zedekiah. This began the first exile, from which only a percentage of Yehudians returned, along with also some from the 10 tribes exiled in Assyria earlier. According to the scriptures and also the Cyrus cylinder, after 70 years in Babylon, Persia, an exile foretold by the prophet Yirmiyahu, who witnessed the destruction of Yerushalayim, those who wanted to return were allowed to do so. The books of Ezra and Nehemiah record the construction of the Second Temple and the rebuilding of Yerushalayim. Ezra and then Nehemiah organized the rebuilding of the city walls, and they governed the province. Alexander the Great, in a long line of conquerors, conquered the Persian Empire, which had conquered the Babylonian Empire. And this, of course, included Yehuda and Yerushalayim. He encouraged Hellenistic culture and Greek thought. Following his death, Yehuda was ruled first by the Ptolemy dynasty, then by the Seleucids under Antiochus the Great. Under the Seleucids, many Jews became Hellenized. Antiochus attempted to Hellenize Yerushalayim and all of Yehuda. He outlawed Torah. Mattityahu, a Cohen, and his 5 sons, especially Yehuda, called the Maccabee, led a rebellion against Antiochus and the paganizers. And as a result of this rebellion, Yerushalayim became the capital of an independent Hasmonean kingdom which lasted more than 100 years. But finally, Yehuda fell under the rule of Rome as an autonomous province first, and still then with a certain amount of independence, with the last Hasmonean king, Mattityahu Antigonus. In 37 BCE, Herod the Great captured Jerusalem, ending Hasmonean rule. He ruled the province of Judea as a client king of the Romans. Herod had married a Hasmonean, but he himself was an Edomite convert to Judaism. He rebuilt the Second Temple, hugely upgraded the surrounding complex, and expanded the minting of coins. Pliny the Elder, writing of Herod's achievements, called Yerushalayim the most famous by far of the eastern cities, and not only the cities of Judea. The Talmud comments that he who had not seen the temple of Herod has never seen a beautiful building in his life. Tacitus wrote, Jerusalem is the capital of the Jews. In it was a temple possessing enormous riches. Herod also built Caesarea Maritima, which replaced Jerusalem as the capital of the Roman province. Following Herod's death, Judea and the city of Yerushalayim came under direct Roman rule through Roman prefects, procurators, and legates, although Herod's descendants remained nominal kings of Judea. In response to a rebellion in 66 CE, Roman legions under the future emperor Titus reconquered and destroyed much of Jerusalem and the Second Temple in the year 70, leaving only what is now called the Kotel, or the Western Wall, the external wall supporting the esplanade of the temple. At the end of this revolt, Jews continued to live in Yerushalayim in significant numbers, although many were sold into exile. Those remaining were allowed to practice their religion only if they paid a special tax called the Jews' tax, which went for the upkeep of their pagan temples. The pagan temples of the Romans, that is. After the Bar Kokhba revolt, 132 to 135 CE, Hadrian built a pagan city, Aelia Capitolina, on the site of Jerusalem. The Roman Forum at the junction of the Cardo and Decimanus had a temple to the goddess Venus. This was later converted into the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Restrictions were placed on Jewish practices such as circumcision and Rosh Chodesh, the keeping of the day that God had set aside to remember creation, the head of the month when the moon rises, causing a revolt that was led by a man called Simon Bar Kokhba, or Kosiba, which is his real name. Hadrian put down the rebellion, killing as many as 500,000 Jews and resettling the city as a totally Roman colony. Jews were forbidden to enter the city except on Tisha B'Av, the day we mourn the destruction of the temple. For the next 150 years, the city remained a relatively unimportant pagan Roman town. The destruction of Jerusalem was a watershed event in Jewish history that began thousands of years of mourning for the city of God. Here's some later history. Emperor Constantine, encouraged by his mother Helena, rebuilt Jerusalem as a Christian center of worship, rebuilding the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in 335 CE. Jews were banned from the city, except during a brief period when Persian rule took over from 614 to 629. The Quran does not mention Jerusalem, but a later hadith, that is a saying, asserted that Jerusalem is the place Muhammad ascended to heaven in his night journey. This was a vision, not an actual event. This city was one of the Arab Caliphate's first conquests in 638 CE. That was the entrance of Islam to the land of Israel. 60 years later, the Mosque of Omar was built, affirming control by the Caliphate of Jerusalem. After 400 years, Jews were finally permitted to return to the city and to practice Judaism within the parameters prescribed by Islam. Under Muslim rule, Jerusalem did not achieve the political or cultural status enjoyed by Damascus or Baghdad or Cairo, much less Mecca and Medina. Jews were among the most vigorous defenders of Jerusalem against the Crusaders. When the city fell, the Crusaders placed all the Jews inside the great synagogue and burnt it to the ground. When Jerusalem was recaptured by Saladin in 1187, worship of all religions was permitted. In 1173, Benjamin of Tudela described Jerusalem as a small city full of Jacobites, Jews, Armenians, Greeks, and Georgians. 200 Jews were said to live in a corner of the city under the Tower of David. In 1517, Yerushalayim was conquered by the Ottoman Empire and enjoyed a period of renewal and peace under Suleiman the Magnificent, who constructed the walls of what is now the Old City. Jews, Christians, and Muslims enjoyed freedom of religion under Suleiman. In 1482, a visiting Dominican priest described Jerusalem as a dwelling place of diverse nations of the world and a collection of all manner of abominations, a reference particularly to Jews. In 1700, Yehuda Chesed led the largest organized group of Jewish immigrants to the land in centuries, and they built the Churva synagogue. In the mid-19th century, with the decline of the Ottoman Empire, the city was a backwater. With a population that never exceeded 8,000, the population was divided into 4 major communities: Jewish, Christian, Muslim, and Armenian, with Jews living mostly on the slope above the Western Wall. A new settlement in 1882, made up of Yemenite Jews, known as the Meshkanot Sha'ananim, eventually flourished and set the precedent for other communities to spring up to the west and to the north of the Old City. In time, communities made up of immigrants from Poland and Russia grew and connected geographically, and this became known as the new city of Jerusalem. When Allenby took Jerusalem from the Ottomans in 1917, the new city was a patchwork of neighborhoods and communities, each with a distinct ethnic character. Anti-Jewish Arab riots in Jerusalem in 1920, 1929, and in the 1930s caused significant damage and deaths. The Jewish community was forced to organize self-defense forces. Some groups carried out bombings and attacks against the British because of their restrictions on immigration and their open support for the Arabs. During the 1930s, 2 important new institutions were created: Hadassah Medical Center and Hebrew University, and they were founded on Mount Scopus. By 1948, 1 in 6 Jews in Palestine lived in Yerushalayim. Before 1948, only Jews living in Haaretz were known as Palestinians. On November 29, 1947, the UN General Assembly approved a plan which partitioned the British Mandate of Palestine into 2 states, one Jewish and one Arab. But please note that Transjordan, 2/3 of the original mandate, had already been given by Britain to the Husseini family, the Sharifs of Mecca, in 1921, a decision that had been taken by Britain alone. So the plan for the division of Palestine was that each state would be composed of 3 major sections linked by extraterritorial crossroads, plus an Arab enclave at Jaffa. By this plan, Greater Jerusalem was to be internationalized. The fight for Jerusalem began before the departure of the British, with heavy casualties among both fighters and civilians. By the end of March 1948, just before the British withdrew, and with the British clearly favoring the Arabs, the roads to Jerusalem were cut off by Arabs, placing the Jewish population of the city under siege. The siege was eventually broken before the partition took effect. Nasser of Egypt publicly announced that the Arab League would push the Jews into the sea. Arabs were told to leave the Jewish part of Palestine because they would soon return to control all the land, although the Jews begged them to stay. The armies of the surrounding nations attacked Israel immediately. 1,500 of the 3,500 mostly ultra-Orthodox Jews in the Old City evacuated to West Jerusalem as a unit. Some Arab inhabitants under Israeli control were moved to East Jerusalem so that avowed enemies could not snipe behind the line. The proposed UN plan for a Jerusalem under international administration would have been completely surrounded by Jordan, with only a highway to connect Jerusalem to Israel. Following the 1948 war, Jerusalem was divided. The western half of the new city became part of the newly formed state of Israel, while the eastern half, along with the old city, was annexed by Jordan. Jordan immediately breached its commitment to appoint a committee to discuss free access by Jews to the holy sites under its jurisdiction. Jordan used Jewish tombstones to pave their new roads. Jordan ransacked 57 ancient synagogues, their libraries, and the centers of religious studies in Old Jerusalem. Jewish buildings were defaced and used to house animals. Appeals made by Jews to the UN and the International Committee received no response. On January 23, 1950, the Knesset passed a resolution that stated Jerusalem was the capital of Israel. It was also Israel's largest city. The high point of the 1967 Six-Day War was the restoration of the whole city of Jerusalem to Israel. Immediately, the Waqf, the Islamic Trust, was granted administration of the Temple Mount by Israel. Jewish prayer on the site was prohibited. Jerusalem of Gold, Yerushalayim Shel Zahav, was rewritten to celebrate Jerusalem's return to our people. The Western Wall has become the center of Jewish life, recovered after nearly 2,000 years in the hands of Goyim. All religions are granted access to their own holy sites. Jewish religious sites, cemeteries, and synagogues have been restored, as has the Jewish quarter of Jerusalem. The international community has never recognized East Jerusalem as part of Israel, and most countries still maintain their embassies in Tel Aviv, thus not recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. In May of 2018, The U.S. under Donald Trump moved its embassy to Jerusalem, and other nations followed. The UN Security Council Resolution 478 states that the Knesset's law declaring Jerusalem Israel's eternal and indivisible capital is null and void and must be rescinded forthwith. Yom Yerushalayim. Well, observance of this day outside the city cannot compare to its celebration in a reunited Jerusalem. In Jerusalem, thousands of people march around the city. They walk through the liberated Old City where Jews were denied access by Jordan from 1948 to 1967. The march ends at the Kotel, the holiest site in Jerusalem and in Judaism, where there are speeches and concerts and dancing. Unusually, a festive Hallel is recited during the prayers. According to Halakas, even those who do not recite the blessing of Hallel on Yom HaAtzmaut should recite it on Yom Yerushalayim, because the liberation and the reunification of the city of Jerusalem is an even greater miracle than Jewish sovereignty over the land of Israel. Here's a personal account of Jerusalem's restoration. Moshe Amarav, a paratrooper, describes his first minutes at the wall. We ran there, a group of panting soldiers lost on the plaza of the Temple Mount, searching for a giant stone wall. We did not stop to look at the Mosque of Omar, even though this was the first time we had seen it close up. Forward, forward, hurriedly we pushed our way through the Maghreb, the eastern gate, and suddenly we stopped, thunderstruck. There it was before our eyes, gray and massive, silent and restrained, the western wall. Slowly, slowly I began to approach the wall in fear and trembling, like a pious cantor going to the lectern to lead the prayers. I approached it as the messenger of my father and my grandfather and of my great-grandfather and of all the generations and all the exiles who had never merited seeing it. And so they had sent me to represent them. Somebody recited the festive blessing. Blessed are you, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who has kept us alive, maintained us, and brought us to this time. But I could not answer amen. I put my hand on the stones, and the tears that started to flow were not my tears. They were the tears of Israel, tears of hope and prayer, tears of Hasidic tunes, tears of Jewish dances, tears which scorched and burned the heavy gray stone. My feeling the first time I was there was similar, that I was standing there on behalf of my grandparents, my great-grandparents, my great-great-grandparents, who did not have this privilege. I hope you'll forgive my emotion at this moment, but for a Jew, this return, the reestablishment of Jerusalem as our capital, this is not only emotionally meaningful, but spiritually meaningful, because this is what God promised. we pray facing Jerusalem, and our prayer services are filled with references to Jerusalem. And thus the unification of Jerusalem is cause for joyous celebration, reversing as it has thousands of years of forced exile. Jerusalem is central to the scriptures. It is central to prophecy and to our nationhood and heritage, as well as to our glorious future when Mashiach Yeshua will return to establish his kingdom from David's throne. He will stand in Jerusalem. Every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that the God of Israel is the only God. Shabbat Shalom.